In 1992, the psychologist Neal Roese and his colleagues asked a large sample of people a simple question: what do you regret most in your life? The answers, when analyzed systematically across this study and the substantial body of research that followed it, revealed something that surprised the researchers conducting it. People's deepest and most persistent regrets were overwhelmingly regrets about things they had not done, rather than things they had done: the unpursued relationship, the career path not taken, the words left unsaid, the risk not attempted. Regrets of inaction, researchers found, substantially outnumbered regrets of action. And critically, regrets of inaction proved to be far more durable and far more psychologically painful over time than regrets of action, which tended to fade in intensity considerably faster. This finding is, on reflection, deeply strange. In the moment of decision, action typically feels riskier than inaction. Doing something carries the visible, immediate possibility of failure, embarrassment, or loss. Not doing something feels safe by comparison, a way of avoiding risk rather than courting it. And yet, the accumulated evidence of decades of research on regret reveals that this intuition, the sense that inaction is the safer choice, is systematically wrong when measured against the metric that actually matters: how a person will feel about the decision years or decades later. Understanding why this asymmetry exists, and what the broader science of regret reveals about the architecture of human decision-making, memory, and emotion, illuminates one of the most practically important and most counterintuitive bodies of research in contemporary psychology. Let's begin with the foundational theoretical framework for understanding what regret actually is. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose collaborative work established the field of behavioral economics and fundamentally reshaped the scientific understanding of human decision-making, proposed in a landmark 1982 paper what they called counterfactual thinking theory as the foundation for understanding regret. Kahneman and Tversky argued that regret is not simply a negative emotion that arises from bad outcomes. It is specifically the emotion that arises from the mental comparison between an actual outcome and an imagined alternative outcome that could have occurred had a different decision been made, a mental process they called counterfactual simulation. This definition matters because it explains a feature of regret that would otherwise be puzzling. The intensity of regret does not correlate simply with the objective badness of an outcome. It correlates specifically with the ease and vividness with which an alternative, better outcome can be mentally simulated. Kahneman and Tversky documented this through a series of experiments, demonstrating what they called the norm theory of regret. Outcomes that deviate from a normal or expected course of events produce more intense regret than outcomes that arise from routine behavior, even when the objective magnitude of loss is identical, because abnormal events generate more vivid and more easily accessible counterfactual alternatives. Their most famous illustration of this principle involved a scenario in which two travelers missed their flight by an identical margin, arriving at the gate 5 minutes after departure. One traveler experienced a routine delay on their normal route to the airport. The other took an unusual detour that, had they not taken it, would have gotten them to the gate in time. Despite experiencing an objectively identical outcome, missing the flight by the same 5 minutes, people consistently judge that the second traveler, whose deviation from routine directly and vividly suggests an easily available alternative path to a better outcome, would experience significantly more intense regret than the first. This finding illuminates something fundamental about how the human mind generates emotional responses to decisions. Emotional intensity is driven not simply by outcomes, but by the psychological accessibility of alternative outcomes that did not occur. And this insight provides the theoretical foundation for understanding why regrets of inaction prove so much more durable and painful than regrets of action over the long term. The psychologist Thomas Gilovich at Cornell University, working with Victoria Medvec, conducted the research that most directly established and explained the temporal asymmetry between regrets of action and regrets of inaction. Gilovich and Medvec's research found a consistent pattern across multiple studies and multiple populations. When people are asked about regrets from the recent past, regrets of action tend to predominate, but when people are asked about their most significant life regrets, viewed across a longer time horizon, regrets of inaction become dramatically more common and dramatically more psychologically salient. Gilovich and Medvec proposed a specific cognitive mechanism to explain this temporal reversal, connecting to the same counterfactual thinking framework Kahneman and Tversky had established. In the short term, actions that lead to bad outcomes produce vivid, easily available counterfactuals, because the specific negative consequence of the action is immediately present and salient. If you took a risk and it failed, the failure is right in front of you, generating an intense but relatively short-lived counterfactual comparison to the safer path you did not take. Inaction, by contrast, does not produce an immediate, vivid negative consequence in the same way. The failure to act typically produces an absence rather than a presence, a gap in one's life story rather than a specific bad event to point to. But this absence, precisely because it lacks a specific, bounded negative consequence that can eventually be processed and resolved, remains psychologically open-ended in a way that action-based regrets do not. Gilovich and Medvec found that this open-endedness allows the imagination to generate an essentially unlimited range of counterfactual alternatives for what might have happened had the unpursued path been taken, and this unboundedness is precisely what makes regrets of inaction so much more psychologically persistent. The psychologist and memory researcher Roese, extending his own foundational 1992 research in subsequent decades, developed what he calls the temporal pattern of regret, documenting that this action-inaction asymmetry follows a highly consistent developmental trajectory across the human lifespan. Roese's research found that regrets of action are more common and more intensely felt in young adulthood, while regrets of inaction become increasingly dominant and increasingly intense as people move through middle age and into later life, a pattern that holds across multiple cultures and multiple methodological approaches to measuring regret. Roese's interpretation of this developmental pattern connects to what he calls the opportunity principle. Regret intensity is substantially shaped by the perceived remaining opportunity to correct or compensate for the regretted decision. A young adult who regrets a specific action, such as a poor choice in a romantic relationship or an ill-advised financial decision, typically still perceives ample remaining life opportunity to recover from or compensate for that specific mistake, which limits the intensity and duration of the resulting regret. An older adult who regrets a fundamental inaction, such as never having pursued a particular career path or never having attempted a significant creative or personal ambition, faces a closing window of remaining opportunity to correct that specific omission, which intensifies rather than diminishes the regret as time passes. This opportunity principle has been extended and refined by the psychologist Amy Summerville at Miami University, whose research on what she calls the regret optimization framework found that people experience the most intense regret, specifically regarding decisions that remain, at least in principle, correctable, and that regret intensity tends to decrease, somewhat counterintuitively, once a decision becomes genuinely and permanently irreversible. Summerville's research suggests that regret functions, at least in part, as a motivational signal specifically calibrated to spur corrective action, and that the psychological system generating regret becomes less active once correction is no longer a live possibility, a finding with significant implications for understanding why certain regrets fade over time while others intensify. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses an important question the basic action-inaction framework does not fully resolve: whether the specific content and domain of a regret matters as much as its temporal structure, and what this reveals about the particular life domains in which human beings are most susceptible to enduring, unresolved regret. The psychologist Neal Roese, in extending his original research, identified what he calls the domain specificity of regret, documenting that certain life domains generate dramatically more frequent and more intense regret than others, largely independent of the objective magnitude of the decisions involved. Roese's research found that regrets concerning education, career, and romance consistently rank as the most commonly reported and most intensely experienced categories of life regret across large survey samples, while regrets concerning more immediately consequential decisions, such as health behaviors or financial choices, though certainly present, tend to be reported with somewhat less frequency and intensity than might be predicted by their objective life impact alone. Roese proposes that this domain specificity connects directly to the identity relevance of the decision in question. Decisions in the domains of education, career, and romance are disproportionately identity-defining. They do not simply produce a specific outcome, but shape the ongoing trajectory of who a person becomes, the social world they inhabit, and the daily texture of their subsequent life experience. A regretted decision in a less identity-central domain, such as a specific financial misstep, typically produces a bounded consequence that, however costly, does not continue to generate new counterfactual comparisons indefinitely. A regretted decision in an identity-central domain continues to generate fresh counterfactual comparisons throughout the rest of a person's life, because virtually every subsequent life experience provides a new occasion to imagine how different one's life would be had the alternative path been taken. The psychologist Colleen Saffrey at Wilfrid Laurier University has extended this analysis specifically to romantic regret, documenting through longitudinal research that regrets concerning romantic relationships, including both regretted actions, such as poor relationship choices, and regretted inactions, such as never having pursued a meaningful romantic interest, show a distinctively durable quality compared to regrets in most other life domains, persisting with measurable emotional intensity even decades after the relevant decision point, and continuing to be spontaneously recalled and reprocessed throughout adulthood in ways that regrets in more bounded domains typically do not. Saffrey's research also documented an important qualification to the general action-inaction asymmetry. While inaction regrets predominate overall in long-term recall, action regrets in the specifically identity-central domains, including romantic and career decisions that were actively pursued but that led to significant negative consequences, can generate comparably durable and comparably intense regret to inaction regrets, when the action in question was sufficiently identity-defining. This finding refines the basic Gilovich and Medvec framework by suggesting that the crucial variable determining regret durability may be less about the action-inaction distinction in itself and more about whether a given decision, whether it involved doing something or refraining from doing something, opened or foreclosed an identity-defining life trajectory that continues to generate fresh counterfactual comparison throughout the remainder of a person's life. The neuroscience of regret has developed substantially over the past 2 decades, illuminating the specific neural mechanisms underlying this emotional experience. The neuroscientist Giorgio Coricelli at the University of Southern California has conducted extensive brain imaging research, documenting that the experience of regret specifically activates the orbitofrontal cortex, a brain region involved in evaluating the outcomes of decisions relative to alternative outcomes that could have been chosen. Coricelli's research found that patients with damage to the orbitofrontal cortex show a specific and striking deficit. They continue to experience disappointment when outcomes are objectively bad, but they fail to show the elevated, specifically regret-related distress that healthy individuals show when a bad outcome could have been avoided by choosing differently, and correspondingly, patients with orbitofrontal damage fail to adjust their subsequent decision-making behavior in response to regret in the way that healthy individuals reliably do. This finding is significant because it demonstrates that regret is not simply an intensified form of ordinary disappointment, but involves a functionally distinct neural and psychological process, one specifically dedicated to comparing actual outcomes against counterfactual alternatives, and using that comparison to guide future decision-making. Coricelli's research on what he calls regret aversion, the tendency of healthy individuals to make choices specifically designed to minimize the anticipated future experience of regret, even when this leads to objectively worse expected outcomes in a purely economic sense, has documented that this anticipatory regret avoidance mechanism operates largely automatically and exerts substantial influence over everyday decision-making, well beyond what people are consciously aware of. The relationship between regret and psychological well-being has been examined extensively by the psychologist Marcel Zeelenberg at Tilburg University, whose research has documented a genuinely paradoxical finding. While the experience of regret is subjectively unpleasant, the capacity to experience regret appears to be functionally adaptive, and individuals who report a complete absence of significant life regrets do not show correspondingly higher measures of psychological well-being. Instead, both extremely high regret and the complete absence of regret are associated with worse psychological outcomes than a moderate, well-processed experience of regret regarding specific, meaningful past decisions. Zeelenberg's research proposes that regret serves an essential function in what he calls decision learning, the process through which individuals extract and encode lessons from past choices to improve future decision-making, and that the capacity to feel regret, however subjectively uncomfortable, reflects a psychological system that is working correctly rather than malfunctioning. The complete absence of regret, on this account, may indicate either a failure to learn from experience or a psychological defense mechanism that, while reducing short-term discomfort, forecloses the kind of genuine self-reflection that regret, at its most functional, is designed to promote. There is one further body of research worth examining, because it addresses the practical question of whether the well-documented psychology of regret can be leveraged deliberately to improve real-world decision-making, rather than simply being observed and described after the fact. The psychologist Daniel Pink, synthesizing the accumulated behavioral science research on regret in his 2022 book The Power of Regret, has proposed that the systematic study of what people regret most, and specifically the finding that inaction regrets vastly outweigh action regrets over the long term, can be used as a deliberate decision-making heuristic in the moment of choice, rather than simply as a retrospective explanatory framework applied after regret has already occurred. Pink's synthesis organizes the accumulated research findings into 4 core regret categories that recur with remarkable consistency across cultures and populations. Foundation regrets, concerning failures to build stable foundations in health, education, or finances early in life. Boldness regrets, concerning failures to take chances when opportunities were available. Moral regrets, concerning instances of behaving in ways that violated one's own ethical standards. And connection regrets, concerning relationships that were allowed to fade or that were never pursued. Pink's analysis found that boldness regrets and connection regrets, both of which are predominantly regrets of inaction in the specific sense documented by Gilovich and Medvec, account for the substantial majority of the most intensely reported and most enduringly painful regrets across his synthesis of the research literature, providing further empirical confirmation of the basic action-inaction asymmetry while adding specificity about exactly which categories of inaction generate the most durable regret. The behavioral scientist Katherine Milkman at the University of Pennsylvania has approached the practical application of regret research from a different angle, documenting through a series of field experiments that deliberately prompting people to imagine their future regret before making a decision, a technique she calls prospective hindsight or the regret minimization framework, measurably improves decision quality across a range of contexts including financial planning, health behavior, and career decisions. Milkman's research found that explicitly asking decision-makers to imagine themselves at a future point looking back on the decision they are about to make, and to identify which choice they believe their future self would regret not having made, produces systematically different and, by multiple objective measures, better decisions than asking people to evaluate the same choice using conventional cost-benefit reasoning, focused on immediate outcomes. This prospective hindsight technique has an interesting theoretical justification connecting back to the core counterfactual thinking framework established by Kahneman and Tversky, because the research consistently shows that inaction generates more durable and more intense regret than action over long time horizons. Deliberately simulating this future regret at the point of decision effectively imports information from the future emotional consequences of a choice into the present moment of decision-making, information that would otherwise only become available, and by then only in the painful and non-actionable form of lived regret, considerably later in life. The technique essentially uses the documented psychology of long-term regret as a deliberate corrective to the well-documented tendency of in-the-moment decision-making to systematically overweight the immediate, visible risks of action relative to the delayed, diffuse, but ultimately more psychologically consequential risks of inaction. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of regret not as a purely negative psychological phenomenon to be minimized or eliminated, but as a sophisticated cognitive and emotional system that evolved to serve a specific and important function, extracting maximal learning value from the comparison between actual outcomes and the better outcomes that might have been achieved through different choices, and using that comparison to guide improved future decision-making. But the specific asymmetry between regrets of action and regrets of inaction reveals something further and more practically significant about how this system actually operates in human life. Because inaction produces open-ended, unbounded counterfactual possibilities, rather than the bounded, specific counterfactuals generated by failed action, and because the perceived remaining opportunity to correct an omission diminishes over the life course in a way that intensifies, rather than resolves the associated regret, the paths not taken accumulate a disproportionate and ever-growing weight in the human psychological experience of a life, considerably exceeding the weight carried by the specific failures and mistakes that resulted from paths that were actually taken. The relationship you did not pursue, the words you did not say, the risk you did not take, These generate, in the human mind, not a single specific counterfactual to be processed and eventually resolved, but an entire unbounded space of imagined alternative lives, each one available to be summoned by memory and imagination for as long as the actual life that was lived continues. This is not a reason to act recklessly, or to treat every hesitation as a future regret waiting to happen, but it is a genuine and well-documented feature of how the human mind processes the comparison between what happened and what might have happened, one that systematically underweights, in the moment of decision, exactly the kind of regret that research shows will ultimately weigh the most. The failure that resulted from trying is, in the long run, usually easier to live with than the failure that resulted from never trying at all. Not because trying guarantees a better outcome, but because trying, whatever its result, closes the door on the one kind of regret that never finds a natural end. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.